This week's announcement from the New South Wales Government that it would be putting its remaining power stations up for sale will have the big utilities reaching for the spreadsheets to value them. Among them may well be the big Anglo-French outfit International Power GDF Sewers, which is also bidding for government compensation to close the Hazelwood Power Station in Victoria, Australia's largest carbon emitter. I spoke to International Power's Australian chief, Tony Concannon, about the future of his company and electricity generally in Australia. Well, Tony Concannon, the New South Wales Government said now that it's going to sell the remaining power generators in New South Wales. Is International Power a buyer?
The timing's not ideal for us. I mean, our main focus is still on the clean energy future legislation, getting all the regulations bedded down. There's a lot of work still to do in that particular area. But New South Wales, I mean, is a potential growth state for us, and we're definitely going to have a look.
Well, do you think the process in New South Wales should be delayed?
Clearly, the timing of such a large-scale sale like this is a prerogative of the state government. Not ideal for us. With other players, it may be fine for them. What would be ideal for us, frankly, is from mid-next year onwards. But as I mentioned before, you know, that really isn't up for us to decide, so we'll definitely have a look, but our main priority remains on the clean energy future and contract for close.
They've said they're not going to sell the poles and wires. Do you think they should?
Yes, I think they should. In fact, I think the largest unlocking of capital in New South Wales in the electricity sector would be from the sale of the poles and wires. I think there'll be a very large competition for that in Australia. I think there's going to be less competition for some of the generation assets.
Do you understand why they've decided not to?
No, I don't.
You have put in an expression of interest for what's called the contract for closure, which was due on October the 21st. So have you had feedback that it was a compliant bid and you're now in the running for that money?
We've had no feedback. Details are still very, very sketchy. We're obviously part of a competitive bid process, and so there's only so much I can say, you know, here today. But we're doing our best. We'll give it our best shot. We don't know what the terms are, but what there is a promise of potentially more certainty for our employees and for the business.
But you haven't managed to find out how much money they've got available for this?
No.
I suppose it's essentially a competitive tender between you and True Energy, which is owned by China Light and Power, since they own your lawn and you own Hazelwood, so that those are the only two large power stations that qualify because of the emissions intensity.
That's correct. That's our understanding too. It's not confirmed whether our competitor has put the bid in. We suspect they have. But we anticipate there's probably two large players and three small players. One of those small players we think may be disqualified, but that will remain too small, too large.
Right. And the company that puts in the lowest price for closing their power station wins the tender, is that correct?
We haven't seen the detailed terms, so we don't know the criteria the government's going to use for selection.
Now, you've mentioned that you regard the passage of the Clean Energy Future legislation as half-time. What do you mean by that?
There's still a lot to do. I mean, there's some aspects of the rate of legislation is very good. Some aspects we're still working through with government, and there are still some residual issues which we feel, you know, frankly, more work needs to be done. So there's a lot of regulation, for example, and some very detailed points in that regulation, and we've only seen a very, very small amount of that regulation as of today. There's not much time. We're talking about this new scheme being in operation in 7 months' time, so frankly we're running out of time in that respect. So there's a lot to do in that space.
Yeah, but do you feel like there's more or less certainty now? I mean, you've got, we've got a delicate political situation in Australia. The opposition coalition is against the proposal, the clean energy. They're entirely against the emissions trading scheme, the carbon tax. They have another scheme in place. I mean, how do you feel all this plays out in terms of investment in power generation in Australia over the next decade or so?
I think it's still a difficult environment at this moment in time in terms of large-scale investment. I think for a number of reasons. It's not just political, it's also the legislation. One of the main determinants of CO2 price going forward is what's known as the cap trajectory. So it's effectively, what is the cap that Australia is going to place upon itself going forward. And that isn't described yet by the Australian government.
Well, we know what they're heading towards, but we don't quite know how they're going to get there.
We don't know how they're going to get there, and that's not going to be described until May 2014. And in fact, for 2020, it won't be described till June 2016. So that's still quite a way away to actually sort of move into frankly, more certainty. We'd obviously ideally like, as business, we'd like a bipartisan sort of agreement. That would be ideal. We're not there with that. The final thing really is on financing. You know, there's quite a lot of financing which is coming up for refinancing, and these are billions of dollars. Now, we've raised that money before in the generation space. We've got to do it again. And I think some investors feel a bit bruised, really, about some of the process which Australia's gone through since 2008. It was no surprise to me, for example, recently to see a government report which showed committed investments in the generation sector have gone from over 8,000 megawatts in 2008 to 1,500 megawatts as of today. We think that was all the unease for both banks as well as equity.
Well, what about you? Are you going to invest in new power generation, apart from possibly buying New South Wales assets that are on the market?
As I mentioned before, our first priority is to button down the clean energy future. That's a massive, massive issue for us. We have to make sure that the arrangements that are articulated in the clean energy future policy are buttoned down in the regulation, and frankly that the conditions surrounding those are reasonable.
Yeah, but there was a presentation recently in London by International Power which talked about growth in Australia, and there was kind of this optimistic tone to the presentation. Is there growth for you in Australia, as far as you can tell?
I think we're definitely looking at growth opportunities in Australia.
And is that in gas or wind or coal, black coal?
We're fuel and technology agnostic. We will look at the economics, we'll look at what makes sense, and if it makes economic sense, we'll definitely look at it.
Does wind make sense?
Wind doesn't make sense today. We've built wind farms here. We've built wind farms in over 36 countries, but as part of the larger group. But when you look at the economics today, it doesn't make sense. There are reasons for why it doesn't make sense, but we think there's some, the prices will make sense from sort of 2015 onwards.
Thanks for joining us, Tony Concannon.
Thank you very much, Alan.